Well, good evening. I'm Reverend Andrea Cano, and on behalf of Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon, I welcome you to this year's Collins Summit. Bienvenidos, bienvenidas to all who are here in this sanctuary of the Imago Dei community in Portland, Oregon, and especially to all of you, virtual community, almost 500 strong, throughout the state of Oregon and in the nation. And by the way, this is our first in-person event since 2019. So supported by the Collins Foundation for 54 years, the Collins Summit has bravely taken on subjects at the center of current events, and heaven knows tonight is no exception. This year, we explore Christian nationalism, the belief that the U.S. is defined by Christianity and the government should keep it that way. Now, while we feel there is a lot of urgency around this conversation, we find ourselves incredibly divided as a nation, within our families, and we often struggle to understand one another. So the question is, of how faith should interact with the political landscape is one we have asked for our country since its founding. Now, we aren't likely to solve the problem tonight, but it is our hope that this discussion will promote understanding, deep thinking, and civic engagement that is both nuanced and inclusive. So this evening, we will hear from two writers, Kristin Du Mez, professor and historian at Calvin University, and best-selling author of the book, Jesus and John Wayne. Du Mez chronicles how white evangelical leadership corrupted a faith and fractured a nation. And maybe something fell. Kaitlin Curtice of the Potawatomi Nation is a Christian and the author of Native. Curtice not only maps the genocidal legacies of American colonialism, which even continues today, but she also calls us, all of us, from conservative to progressive faith practices or political perspectives, to decolonize ourselves. Decolonize this nation. For to be a place of we the people, we must be a place for all the people. After the presentations, a panel discussion will follow, moderated by the Reverend Michael Ellick, the EMO's Director of Public Engagement. And we will also hear inspired music from Johanna Jones and the musicians. And we also will learn what's new from Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon, from Paul Lefebvre, our Communications and Development Director. We'll then close our evening with gratitudes and a benediction. So now, may we begin and center our community with a prayer from Minister Sean Langdon of the Community of Christ of the Greater Pacific Northwest. Sean.
Good evening, friends. Let us begin with prayer. O Holy One, sacred guide, loving parent, whether it be physically present in this space or connected by your Holy Spirit through the power of modern technology, what a blessing it is to be in community tonight, to learn, to grow together, but also to continue the uncomfortable but necessary journey of deconstructing our fears and prejudices in the lies that our history has taught us, and make way for truth to be born. Truth that comes from listening, truth that comes from awareness, truth that inspires an intention to seek forgiveness for the sins not only of our own, but of those who have come before us. God, we know that much harm has been done in your name. We know that your name has been used in ways that have brought fear and pain and distress. And God, yes, even death to your children and this earth. We confess of the ways that we might have been players of this sin in the past and in the present, whether it be directly so or standing by, ignoring your nudge to stand up, speak out, and do something about it. We know, O God, that this sin that I speak of is often perpetuated by religion and people who claim to follow you, but it is not of you. So as a people of faith, may we not only confess of what has been and what is, may we commit to you and to your brothers and sisters and non-binary siblings in communities near and far at this time and always to do better, to be better, to build better, and again, to always listen better. May we open ourselves now to letting your Holy Spirit not only flood the places that we gather from tonight, but also the vessels of humanity that is each and every one of us. May we be open to the ways in which the spark of the divine is igniting in us a new but continued sense of urgency to live out the holy text from the prophet Isaiah that informed the mission of Jesus Christ found in the Gospel of Luke chapter 4. For the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. And just as this text was Christ's mission statement, may it be ours as well. God, there is so much darkness in your land, but there is also hope and light. May our eyes be open to the realities of the world around us, but with a resolve to respond in ways that uphold the dignity of story and person and concern. O Holy One, I'm reminded of a beloved hymn that we sing often in my faith community, and may the text of that hymn be our plea and resolve at this time. Come and bring light to a people in darkness. Come, set us free from the chains we have made. We are your people, the flock that you tend. Lord, open our eyes once again to the ones brokenhearted, to the plight of the poor, to the innocent children. Open our eyes, teach us compassion and love, to the victims of violence, to the ones who seek justice, to those sitting in prison. Open our eyes, teach us compassion and love. When a color divides us, when the darkness surrounds us, when we choose to look elsewhere, open our eyes, teach us compassion and love. To those full of life's sorrows, to the needs of the lowly, to the ones who seek peace, open our eyes, teach us compassion and love. To those suffering illness, to those trapped by addiction, to those lost or forgotten, open our eyes, teach us compassion and love. Come and bring light to a people in darkness. Come, set us free from the chains we have made. We are your people, the flock that you tend. Lord, open our eyes once again. May it be so. Amen.
So again, welcome everybody. We're going to sing this song called Great Are You, Lord. And we invite you to sing with us if you like. Those who are joining us online, you can sing with us as well. Great are you, Lord. give life. You are love. You bring light to the darkness. You give hope and you restore every heart that is broken. So great are you, Lord. Oh, great are you, Lord. Sing, you give life. You are love. You bring light to the dark. You give hope. You restore every heart
Kristin Du Mez is a New York Times bestselling author and professor of history and gender studies at Calvin University. She holds a PhD from the University of Notre Dame, and her research focuses on the intersection of gender, religion, and politics. Kristin has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, NBC News, Religion News Service, and Christianity Today. She has been interviewed on NPR, CBS, and the BBC, among other outlets. Her most recent book is Jesus and John Wayne: How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation.
Hi, I'm Christian Du Mez, and I'm speaking to you today from West Michigan, from the ancestral lands of the Ojibwa, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. These lands were claimed by white Americans, and they were settled by, among others, Dutch immigrants. Some of these Dutch immigrants went on to found Calvin University, where I now teach, and I teach in the history department and gender studies program. I wanted to talk to you today about Christian nationalism from a historical perspective. Now, Christian nationalism is a rather simple concept. In my book, Jesus and John Wayne, I define it simply as the idea that America was founded as a Christian nation and must be defended as such. Now, this defense can take a variety of different forms. It involves defending American Christianity, defending one's conception of orthodoxy, of faithfulness. And so it can involve defense against internal enemies. It also involves defending Christian America against external threats. So with a kind of militarism, fighting wars. And so it functions in a way where Christian America must be defended against enemies internally, fueling kind of culture wars, militancy, and externally fueling American militarism. Now, Christian nationalism is not a new thing. In fact, one of the things I like to do when I teach American history is to assign an older book, a somewhat classic book now, a book that was published in 1983, so before my students were born. And this book is called The Search for Christian America. And it was written in the early 80s by three evangelical historians, Mark Knoll, George Marsden, and Nathan Hatch. George Marsden would go on to be my advisor, and I've worked very closely with him. What's striking about this book, written in 1983, is that just how timely it is today. But Marsden, Knoll, and Hatch were writing as conservative evangelicals, speaking to other evangelicals at the time, but also as professional historians. And they wanted to clear a few things up. First, they pointed to this kind of upswell of Christian nationalism in American evangelicalism and in American Christianity. And they pointed to something that happened just a few years earlier as kind of a catalyst for this. And that was the bicentennial celebration in 1976. At that time, Americans were celebrating the nation's birth, and conservative Christians were also celebrating the nation's birth, but very much in terms of Christian nationalism, that God had ordained America to have this special role to play. And so 1976 was a year filled with pageantry, lots of red, white, and blue, lots of God and country prayers and sermons. And that didn't really go away after 1976. And it's important to situate the celebration of the nation's bicentennial in the context of this period where we really see the coalescing of the religious right, where we see conservative Christians moving into the Republican Party, shaping the Republican Party. The Southern strategy is part of this. We have a lot of white Southern Democrats abandoning the Democratic Party because of civil rights and moving into the Republican Party. So that by 1980, we have the election of Ronald Reagan, the emergence of the moral majority, Jerry Falwell, and so on. And this is in full swing by 1983. And it's in that context that these three self-identified conservative white evangelical men, who also happen to be historians, said, this isn't entirely accurate here. There are some very deep problems with this celebration of Christian nationalism. First of all, it's historically inaccurate. America was not founded as a Christian nation by any logical, commonsensical definition of the term. So they ask the readers, what does it take to be a Christian nation? How many of a nation's citizens have to be faithful Christians to count as a Christian nation? And yes, we can look to the Puritans who declared themselves a city upon a hill and thought that they were establishing a Christian nation. But at what point do actions also get weighed in as part of this equation? So the very Puritans that were, praying to God and believing that they were being faithful to God's word, were also slaughtering Native Americans in order to clear that path. They were also persecuting Quakers who had slightly different religious beliefs than they did. And so Marsden, Nolan, and Hatch rightly ask, what does it really mean to be a Christian nation? And this is something that they challenged their fellow Christians with in the early 1980s. It always strikes me when I read that book, decades old now, just how significant their critique was, and yet how their project ultimately failed, because the book is just as relevant today, if not more so, than it was in 1983. So before I jump back to the present and make some further reflections on a Christian engagement with Christian nationalism, I wanted to walk us through history just a bit and see how and where this commitment to America having some mythical Christian identity really came to the fore. Now, as I mentioned, we could start with the Puritans, and we wouldn't be wrong in doing so. And we can find examples of this belief in Christian nationalism, this belief that America was somehow special and had a special role to play, kind of sprinkled through American history. I want to pick up with this in the early 20th century, in part because I'm a 20th century specialist, but also because as important as it is to look for continuity, American Christians always thought that they were God's chosen nation. That's not actually the case, because change over time is also really critical to the study of history. And so I want to jump into the early 20th century, where we see that things looked rather different then than they do now, particularly around this issue of Christian nationalism. And often wartime is a really good moment to see the emergence of and kind of the vocal representation of convictions, belief that America is a Christian nation and that God is on our side. And so if we look at World War I, what we see is quite interesting. You certainly had a lot of Americans and American Christians believing that their involvement in the First World War was something that they were doing not just as Americans, but as Christians. But what's interesting is that this belief in Christian nationalism then didn't really fall along the liberal conservative divide. So you certainly had some conservative Protestants who were gung-ho Christian nationalists, people like Billy Sunday, who literally leapt atop a pulpit, waving the American flag and rallying Christians to the wartime cause. Now, you also had a lot of liberal Protestants who were also embracing Christian nationalism in a slightly different way, thinking that America had a special role to play, making the world safe for democracy. And so there was this liberal Protestant faith in human progress and faith in what America's special role in the world might be. You also had conservative Protestants, some conservative Protestants, starkly reject Christian nationalism during the First World War. And this is really interesting, and it's hard for people to wrap their head around because so much has changed since that time in the last century. But you had a number of conservative Protestant leaders and institutions and denominations reject Christian nationalism because to be a Christian meant to have your soul saved, right? And a nation didn't have a soul. So what did it even mean to talk of a Christian nation? Plus, look around you. Look at the behavior of many Americans. Look at the decline in morality. Look at the poverty. Look at all of the hardships and the behaviors. And what did it mean to even be Christian America? And you also had a number of conservative Protestants who were pacifists at the time for related reasons, and particularly in the Anabaptist tradition, and many Pentecostals were also pacifists during the First World War. And I set this out because it's important to show that change over time. Otherwise, it's pretty easy to fall into this trap of believing that history is kind of inevitable, and slipping into the thought that, well, Christians are always Christian nationalists, or Christians are always going to hold these views and be pro-America and pro-military, when in fact history disrupts that. And once we realize that this isn't an inevitable alliance, then we can start to ask the question of, okay, well, why at particular moments did particular Christians embrace Christian nationalism, and to what ends? Okay, so that's our little preliminary history lesson. To understand where our contemporary alignments really came into focus, we have to go to the 1940s, okay? So in the 1940s, we're in the middle of the Second World War, right? World War II, the Good War. This war, perhaps more than any other that America has fought, it can kind of hold up to that status. This is the good war. This is, we were attacked, and you've got evil Hitler on the other side. And so it was pretty easy for Americans and American Christians to rally around this cause. Many conservative Protestants who had kept the military and the war effort during the First World War at arm's length and had their patriotism challenged, including by liberal Protestants, were kind of making up for that this time around and threw themselves in the war effort wholeheartedly, and really saw this as their patriotic duty as Americans. I mean, Billy Graham came to prominence in the Youth for Christ movement during World War II, and his revivals were filled with this patriotism and promotion of the war effort. Okay, so that's World War II. Immediately after the Second World War comes to an end, within a couple of years, we find ourselves in the Cold War. And this is the moment especially when American Christians, and particularly conservative Protestants, really embrace the values of Christian nationalism. Right? We saw that kind of growing during the Second World War, but the Cold War was this perfect moment because there was a very real threat, communism, right? And communism was anti-God, anti-family, and anti-American. So all of the things that conservative Protestants held most dear. And these values all came together for conservative Protestants. Family values, gender traditionalism. We need strong men, strong Christian men to defend faith, family, and nation. And it was a very real defense, right? Military defense on the battlefields of the Cold War. We need to defend Christian America. We need to defend the strength of Christianity. And they're still licking their wounds from the fundamentalist modernist divide when they felt that they had really lost their influence over American Christianity and American society. And they were coming together in the 1940s to reclaim their place at the center of America. 1942, the formation of the National Association of Evangelicals. This was their precise plan to come together, strengthen numbers, and reassert their authority and their influence over American society. The Cold War was the perfect moment to accomplish this, in part because the values that conservative evangelicals held dear were held in common with many other Americans, particularly white middle-class Americans, right? This was the post-war baby boom, Leave It to Beaver era, so gender traditionalism was all the rage. And this was the Cold War consensus era. So you had liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats, all really investing in Cold War militarism and anti-communism. This all changed in the 1960s. It was in the 1960s that many of these core values were called into question. The rise of feminism, resurgence of feminism, challenged gender traditionalism, these traditional gender roles, patriarchy and female submission. The civil rights movement questioned, challenged conceptions of American goodness, right, throughout all of American history. If America was God's chosen nation, how do we explain the evils of race-based chattel slavery? How does that mesh with our conception of Christian America from its founding to the present? And then you have the Vietnam War. And here too, reports from the battlefields in Vietnam led many Americans to start to doubt American goodness and American greatness. And it was in the context of all of these disruptions that conservative white evangelicals doubled down on all of these values. And they understood now and resented the fact that these values were no longer held in common with many other Americans. They came to see themselves more than ever as this marginalized remnant, the faithful remnant. And it was up to them to maintain a faithful Christian presence and to maintain the strength of Christian America, which extended to the military strength. And this is where we see a very tight relationship develop between conservative white evangelicals and the U.S. military. Billy Graham, too, is at the center of that alliance. And between American evangelicals and American militarism, very aggressive, anti-communist, pro-Cold War mentality. And all of this was linked up as part of evangelicals' religious identity and cultural identity in the 1960s and the 1970s. And that brings us up to 1976, the bicentennial. And so celebrating America's history really meant celebrating these particular values for the majority of conservative white Americans. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how these values have really permeated conservative white Christianity in this country for generations now. Because the truth is, if you ask the average American Christian, are you a Christian nationalist? They will probably say no. That's not really insider lingo. That's not terminology that most American Christians would even be familiar with up until the last 2 or 3 years, maybe 4 or 5 years, and certainly isn't language that they would use to describe themselves. In fact, most evangelicals would not primarily describe themselves first and foremost as evangelical, at least not until recently, if at all. Instead, they would simply identify through as Christians, default generic Christians. And there's great power in that, in not needing to define yourself through any more particularities, simply having the confidence and the privilege to identify oneself simply as default Christian. Now, what goes along with that is this God and country faith, this Christian nationalist value system that is linked to white racial privilege. It is linked to American militarism, and in many cases, it is linked to gender traditionalism, to gender difference, to the idea that we need strong patriarchal leaders, that God has filled men with testosterone to equip them to fulfill their God-ordained roles, to be protectors and providers. And in the Cold War, the emphasis was really on the protector. And what does it look like to be a strong protector? Again, it meant defending the faith, so religious authority and culture wars militancy, the faith against internal enemies, and defending the nation against external threats. And so they saw feminism as a threat. Feminism threatened to emasculate American men, leaving them unable to defend America on the battlefields of Vietnam. This world was a brutal world. The enemies were at the gates, and it required strong, ruthless defense. We needed warriors. We needed heroes, masculine heroes, who could fulfill their God-ordained role to protect Christianity and to protect Christian America. And these values really just permeated conservative Christian subculture through books, right? All kinds of popular books and teachings on America as a Christian nation. This kind of pseudo-historian David Barton, best-selling books on that really whitewash American history, and white American Christians are always the heroes. And America is always God's chosen nation, and God is always on America's side, right? Very popular in Christian circles. In the whole homeschool world, homeschool curriculum absolutely follows this pattern, downplays the evils of slavery. Slaves were very happy, racism not a problem, and really sketches this mythical notion of America being this pure, innocent nation with white Americans at the helm. And creates this false version of American history, and then celebrates that, and then seeks to return in the present to that mythical ideal where conservative white Christians are presumably in power, and where conservative white Christians are always on God's side and God is on their side. So this is kind of how this is working. One of my favorite things to do is to go into my local Hobby Lobby store. And I always go with camera in hand because it's where you can kind of see the material culture of conservative American Christianity on display. And they have aisles and aisles of patriotic home decor. Right, these weathered flags with Bible verses on them, and quotes from Ronald Reagan, and big wall plaques celebrating the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms, and wall plaques celebrating the NRA. And you can get like wall decor that fake guns, 6-shooters, and wall plaques celebrating the American military, and against a red, white, and blue flag background, I stand for the flag and kneel for the Lord. And you can find figurines celebrating law enforcement with Bible verses about how they are doing God's work, and all the figurines are white men. Right. And what sociologists have shown us is that Christian nationalist commitments, like believing that America was founded as a Christian nation, this mythical belief, and then needing to defend it, is closely correlated to things like racism, opposition to immigration, opposition to refugee resettlement, pro-law enforcement, pro-Second Amendment, pro-NRA, anti-gun control, refusing to entertain notions of racial bias in law enforcement situations, in other situations more broadly, right? Anti-critical race theory, anti-systemic racism. All of these, this larger set of issues are closely correlated to the defense of Christian nationalism, to this belief in Christian nationalism. It all holds together. But it has been packaged and sold for generations, this whole constellation of ideas, simply as American Christianity, right? This is just Christianity. You don't need to call it Christian nationalism. You don't need to call it conservative white evangelicalism. It is packaged and sold and embraced by now generations of Americans who think this is simply what it means to be obedient. This is what it means to be a Christian in this country and in our world today. And that's why it's just so powerful and so difficult to uproot. What's the harm in all of this? I think the harm is quite obvious for those who are not considered one of us, right? Who are not considered true Americans, because true Americans are defined in a very narrow way. Conservative, white, Christian Americans who identify with this value system, or increasingly conservative Americans who identify with this value system, whether Christian or not. And here's where things get really interesting. Because this has become such an ideology that is connected to theology but not dependent on theology, it's become a cultural belief system, right? You walk into Hobby Lobby and you'll see what I'm talking about. This is how we can see this value system has spread far beyond conservative evangelical spaces, deep into the mainline, has absolutely shaped mainline Christianity. Many mainliners are consuming these products as well, even leading book studies in their churches on books that perpetuate these ideals. Also, it's spilled over into secular culture. And really, this whole God and country faith has blurred the line between sacred and secular. What is religious and what is secular? When we look at something like Duck Dynasty, are we talking religion here? Are we talking secular culture? And that's the power of this God and country Christian nationalism. Is it ultimately Christian at its heart? It really depends what we're talking about here. In many ways, it has strayed so far from biblical Christianity, and yet it is an ideology that is practiced and preached by in a large and influential group of American Christians. So it can cause and has caused harm not just to our neighbors in this country, also externally as well, through decades of American militarism, with devastating consequences for others and for those in this country as well. I'll return now and close to that book, Search for Christian America from 1983. Because these conservative white evangelical historians back at in that day critiqued Christian nationalism because it was not accurate history, right? It was a myth. It was relying on an erroneous understanding of American history. They critiqued it for that reason, but they also critiqued it as American Christians and as conservative white evangelicals, because they said one of the problems with this, one of the problems with embracing this mythical notion of Christian America is that it ends up disempowering Christians. And it actually paradoxically leads to the secularization of this country that they were so afraid of and so wanted to oppose. Because what it ended up doing is it encouraged Christians to embrace a secular ideology, or at least to embrace an anti-biblical conception of citizenship, conception of history, conception of their neighbors. And by claiming this value system and packaging and selling it as Christian, they lost their ability to create a biblical critique of that value system. They lost their position from which they could formulate a prophetic critique of their own tradition and of their own nation. And so they lost their ability to be faithful Christians by embracing Christian nationalism. And I thought that was such a poignant critique to offer as conservative white evangelical men in the early 1980s. And we really see the rise of the religious right. And they cut through these issues in really powerful ways and sought to issue their fellow Christians a call to greater faithfulness. Again, it was a powerful book in 1983, and yet the fact that this message is still so incredibly relevant today is also, I think, sobering. I would also like to add that as despairing as this narrative might sound, a reminder that the fate of American Christianity does not rest on the faithfulness of conservative white evangelicals or on the faithfulness of white Christians generally. And it's right to focus and to focus a critique on these traditions, particularly in our present moment. But it's also right to remember that there are many manifestations of thriving and faithful Christianity that one can find in this country and outside this country, many of which are neither white nor evangelical, and that it's those voices that we should listen to and that Christians can attune themselves to and help us kind of move from this moment that we find ourselves into a more faithful presence. Thank you.
Well, hello, I'm Reverend Michael Ellick. I am the Director of Public Engagement at Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon. And there is so much for us to unpack from whatever 30 minutes that was. And it could not be more timely today. So to help us sort of think about these things and dig into so much, like every thread we could go off on, I think, today, we've asked for 4 of our faith leader friends from different communities throughout Oregon to gather tonight and to start to unpack this together. So I want to introduce them briefly, very briefly. They each could be our keynote speaker at this event, and then dig into some questions. First, I want to introduce again Reverend Andrea Cano, who is the interim president of Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon. Great to have you here, of course. Reverend Ernestine Flemister is the rector at St. Luke's Church in Grants Pass, Oregon, and drove all the way up here just today. For driving across Oregon. I think she's St. Luke's Episcopal Church. Thank you. And Pastor Rick McKinley is the pastor right here at Imago Dei. Thank you for hosting us. It's great to be here with you. And finally, my friend Sylvester Sal Same is an elder of the Warm Springs, Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, and also made the drive across the mountains today. Thank you for driving, Sal. So I'm kind of going in loose alphabetical order. And Andrea, I wanted to start with you. And I'm going to ask everyone a kind of a version of this same question. But given the fact that you are the president of an ecumenical organization, what is your experience and your community's experience of Christian nationalism, and maybe some of the key ambiguities that you see in the midst of it?
I see three key areas, Michael. I say personally, the destructive effect of Christian nationalism through my culturally ethnic background of Latino, Latina, Latinx communities. And I'll go into it a little bit more. And then second, in general, the dominance of broadcast, cable, satellite, internet, and social media by Christian extremists, mass mediating untruths. And the third part is in regards to myriad efforts of community building, faith, and goodwill, the demonization and denigration of ecumenical and interfaith connections and communities and efforts. So first, from Mexico to Argentina and the Caribbean, we know that they were colonized areas by Catholicism in the 17th and 18th century. And then, of course, later on, I call it the part of the American proselytizing enterprise under the guise of missioning. The mission enterprise started to move into the 19th century, and I use paper. My good reverend here is more electronic than I. So the missionizing experience is to break the Catholic hegemony and also kind of essentially start to export this Christian nationalism to other places. So in the 1980s, for me, the worst example was the installation of the dictator Rios Montt in Guatemala, who was lauded by Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, supported by the Reagan administration. And he was the one that said, a Christian carries a Bible in one hand and a gun in the other. He was finally convicted 30 years later for crimes against humanity and genocide in the killing of 10,000 indigenous Guatemalans. Unfortunately, he never served one day of his 80-year sentence. So you see that moving out into other places. And so, of course, now stateside, in Spanish-speaking, Latino, and Hispanic churches, who fall into kind of non-denominational or Pentecostal or evangelical churches, church camps, who have also been caught up in this Christian nationalism. They're anti-vaxxers, they're anti-LGBTQ, they're anti-climate, they're anti-anything that the Christian nationalists also follow. And so it makes it really difficult to see that even as people come together soon for Christmas, they will still be divided in blue and red camps, and ironically celebrating the birth of the Prince of Peace. So, and second, it's no accident that the religious right has really skirted and upended communications laws and regulations for the Federal Communications Commission, the dominance of media ownership in ways that we could never challenge. And now we see that in the internet and satellite and cable systems. So as you hear these stories, it was also really supported by this undercurrent of control of communications. And of course, it's rampant now in an internet that is not regulated. And third, the ecumenical and interfaith endeavors. Recall how the Barmen Declaration of 1934 by German theologians who opposed the Nazi German Christianity, they came out against that. And also the subordination of church to the state. So we have that to think about. And ecumenical interfaith relationships. We are really fortunate here in Oregon because of the strength that we have of our relationships, the history and the integrity of this organization. But yet it's still challenged in different parts of the state, challenged in different civil sectors, and we also are very concerned about what's happening in places like the southern Oregon coast, where the city council has run an ordinance against an ecumenical food kitchen run by an Episcopal church. St. Timothy's, that's precisely it. So we're concerned about those types of risks between church and state. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Reverend Ernestine, I'm curious too. You sit in a very different community viewing point. And in addition to your experience of Christian nationalism, I'm also curious about what are the counter narratives that you think are appropriate to emerge in this moment, or maybe already are emerging?
Well, thank you. I think the counter narratives that are emerging or peeking the head out of the sand are the narratives of unity, the understanding that we are connected, we're interconnected, we're brothers and sisters, as opposed to the notion that because of external differences like skin color or facial expressions or hair or language, that they matter. I think I have to commend our younger people that are now recognizing this. And I think with each year that we get Pew research, more and more people are deciding not to check the box that says I'm a Christian. And I think the notion and idea of Christian nationalism is so antithetical to the teachings of Jesus Christ that people are coming to recognize that this is not what Christ taught. And unless and until we decide to embrace that, and I think in many areas people are starting to embrace that idea that all of this that we're being told is not actually the teachings of Christ. And I go way back to the notion of the doctrine of discovery, where the Catholic Church gave a caveat to Christopher Columbus that anything you see, claim for us. It belongs to us, and you can do anything that you want with it. And so when we have that notion that other people are devalued because of where they come from, and they may look different than what we look, until we move away from that, and I think the younger people are starting to move away from that, nothing changes. I think the idea that we are so threatened by difference, we are so threatened by something that does not reflect us, is idolatrous. Because God created the difference. God created all of us to be unique and special. And until we recognize that and we understand that, then we have the problem with Christian nationalism that has been telling us, and I think it is so ingrained in our churches, in our society, that it has to be dug up at the root. And the root really falls within us and within our churches and within our denominations. No denomination can claim innocence. None of us are innocent. We're always quick to point the fingers at Muslims and other traditions, and we are right smack dab in the middle of this whole situation. And until we get to the place where we can turn the mirror on ourselves, that we can look at ourselves and recognize what it is that we've been spewing, the poison that we've been spewing, that I'm better and God is on my side. God has no color. God is not on anybody's side because God is on everybody's side. And until we get away from these notions and ideas of superiority, of specialness, I tell people, and yes, I get many surprises, I don't believe in American exceptionalism. Because God makes all of us exceptional. And until we stop spewing the poison, until we stop deluding ourselves, until we stop preaching it from our pulpits, we will continue to have problems, and we will continue to struggle to understand who we are, not only in relationship to one another, but in relationship to God.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Pastor Rick, both in the video and then Reverend Flemister sort of hints at this as well. There's this idea that Christian nationalism in the form that it's in is essentially disempowering Christians as well because of the fact that you're embracing this unbiblical theology. I'm wondering what your take on this is and what you're seeing out there.
Yeah, it's real. She does a wonderful job, I think, in the book of clarifying the definitions of evangelical. You know, this word, that there's sort of this theological definition and then the cultural definition, which is by far taken over. But I think the themes, like in the Bible, that you see is God's people are always a people that are a community being formed in the midst of empires, right? And they're following this king who has led them through self-sacrificing love. And God's sort of call is to radiate and model that way. And so, you know, even for Israel, the only time that they get in trouble is when they become that empire, right? So when they start to reflect that kind of nationalism, they go into judgment and exile. Exile is sort of that biblical metaphor for the way the people of God are to navigate these various cultures within the empire. And I think the challenge for white Christians is that requires, exile is to be on the margins. And we've never been on the margins in our imagination. And so the idea that we aren't in power, that we aren't going to be the dominant culture, we aren't going to have people in office, that the culture isn't going to maybe reflect everything that we might believe, that the options are either we baptize Babylon, in a sense, and just accept it, or we burn it down and rebuild Christendom. Because the way of Jesus is to bless it and resist its idols, and to do that through self-sacrificial love. And I don't think that exists, right, within white American Christianity for the most part. And so it's a really sad time, because it just reveals the apostasy in the church, that we have worshiped Caesar, not Jesus,
Right. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Sal, you're the only member of the panel that is here from an indigenous community here to Oregon. And so I'm particularly interested in what your view of Christian nationalism from Warm Springs, but also what this means in your mind for Native communities going forward in the first half of the 21st century.
Thank you, Michael, and I just want to express it's an honor to be here and to honor you all as well. But in listening to the discussion, I think she fell a little short. She implied some things relative to indigenous experience and thinking. And let me refer to what I'm speaking to. It's a doctrine of discovery. I think most of you have heard about the doctrine of discovery that was created back in the 14th century by one of the popes. And it's based in papal bulls. And these papal bulls speak to the Pope at the time that God offered a way for the monarchs and for the Pope to expand their wealth. So it wasn't a matter of belief or faith that brought us to the beginning. And when I talk about the beginning, let's look even further than what she shared with us and what she implied. I'm speaking to institutional racism. And the doctrine of discovery is the pillar to institutional racism. And in saying that, what I'm saying is that you have to go back to the Greeks, and Greek philosophy. She didn't do that, but in her research, she may have found that because she implied that. And what's the basic pillar to the doctrine of discovery? It's the idea that, shoot, I forgot. It'll the basic thought, the basic premise that institutional racism comes from, and she spoke to it briefly, just touched on it. Basically, the master-slave idiom of the Greeks. And in talking about the complex of government and Christianity, you can look at the beginning when the Greeks began with Plato and Socrates and so on, believing that if you were not a Greek, you were a barbarian. Similarly, the Christianity as it evolved, Christianity believed that in the beginning that if you were not a Christian, you were a barbarian, just as Greek philosophy and Greek thought, Western thought speaks to. If you're not a Christian, you're a barbarian. You could become a Christian, but that didn't mean you weren't a barbarian anymore. So the master-slave is the basic footing and foundation to what we see today. Now, in our experience, so it's not new from the 14th century to the present. And let me give you some examples of what I'm talking about. In U.S. government history and law, case law, Supreme Court law, all are founded in the doctrine of discovery. And what I'm referring to is ownership of land. We native indigenous people, we could live on our own land once dominant, when that cross, which also it was the sword, the cross and the sword, both symbolizing acquiring that land, and it was ordained by God, by some mysterious thing. God said, go out, pillage, rape, enslave, commit genocide of indigenous people, and it's okay, because we're claiming their resources because we need that, because we're expanding, we're growing, and so on. The monarchs and the Pope in his popedom, as it were, because he wanted to expand his wealth. And you've all heard and seen some of the history of that. So when we go back and look at institutional racism, we have to look at the doctrine of discovery and look at the experience that indigenous people, not only of the North American continent, Turtle Island, but look at the Australians, look at the Indians, the Dot Indians, look at the Maoris of New Zealand, look at the Aborigine of Australia. All those places that were colonized all are based in institutional racism and the idea of master-slave. So when we explore and begin talking about this, remember that complex of government and Christianity has coalesced from a time of the Greeks.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah. One more round of applause for all of our panelists tonight. I'm told by the schedule that we're supposed to break now for a minute. I could just go through the night. And so I'm going to see if I can track them down wherever they're staying this evening. But we're going to have this panel back after our second keynote speaker, but we're going to take a 5-minute break to stretch and use the restroom, and the band will play, and that'll be your cue that we're going to start to come back and be together. So thank you, all of you. God bless.
We're going to sing a song, a gathering song here called Happy Song. Now, this song was written during the pandemic. My husband and I, who's on the keyboard, we wrote this song during the pandemic. We were sitting in our living rooms, and also my son here on the bass. We were sitting in our living room. Yeah, clap it up, clap it up. We were sitting in our living room during the pandemic, and we was just, trying to have a good time during all of the sadness. And we said, what can we do to just be happy? And we said, let's write a song called Happy Song. So we did. So hopefully you guys enjoy this song. This is my very first time performing it in front of a live audience. I'm also going to do a rap. So get ready for that. Y'all ready? All right, let's go.
And believe that better days coming and promises near.
jump in the joy and let go of your fear. Get up and dance. Our happy song, happy song. Trade in your sorrow, there's hope for tomorrow. Peace everlasting and overwhelming joy. Happy the people. Get up and dance. A happy song. Oh, hey, happy song. Oh, rejoice in the Lord. Always. Hey, and again I say, rejoice. For those who sow in tears will reap in joy. And the joy of the Lord is our strength. You say, rejoice in the Lord. Always. And again I say, rejoice. For those who sow in tears will reap in joy. And the joy of the Lord is our strength. Say the joy of the Lord is our strength. The joy of the Lord is our strength. Get up and dance. Oh yeah, get up and dance. Oh yeah, everybody get up and dance. Oh, get up and dance. Let me see your happy dance. Woo. Now listen, y'all. There's this song that I used to sing back in the day when I was a little girl, and it's called "If You're Happy and You Know It, Clap Your Hands." Y'all know that song? So we put a little twist on it. I want y'all to sing it with me when you got it, okay? It goes like this. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands, do your dance, get up and show it. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands, do your dance, get up and show it. And you know it, clap your hands, all do your dance. Woo. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands, all do your dance. Oh. Here we go. Listen. Oh, yeah. In North Philadelphia, born and raised. In the church houses where I spent most of my days. Growing up singing, Joe's family was gigging, but playing in the streets is what it was. I was thinking. Life got hard with a slave to lust. Absent of God, living dangerous. I was sleeping around, I even tried polygamy. That's when I knew I was hit by the enemy. Then I realized, wait a minute, hold up. I'm a child of the king, man, I gotta grow up. I remembered the scriptures that I'm beautifully made. Handcrafted in this image, I'm dope. Hip hop, it's a day. You see me dancing, just know I'm happy. And if you're happy, just dance to me. Woo! If you're happy, wow. And you know, wow. Get up and show. Get up and show. And you know it. Hey, get up and dance. Get up and dance. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, let's just clap one more time for Johanna Jones and team. Yes. Yes, beautiful. Thank you for being here tonight. The vibrancy of that music. I don't know what it's like for those of you who are watching online, but I have a hunch you're missing out because it's filling the room with a lot of joy and a lot of grace. So thank you for being here tonight. We really appreciate you. My name is Paul Lefebvre. I do development and communications for Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon. I want to take a minute to thank some folks who helped to make tonight possible. First, our longtime partner in this event, the Collins Foundation. Thank you for all that you do to make tonight possible. And to Pastor Rick McKinley and the team here at Imago, Tyler and Bob and everyone else, thank you for being so welcoming to us. And you can see in your bulletins, and for those of you who are watching online, you can see on the screens a list of co-sponsors. Thank you for making this event possible. And the reality is that everybody who paid to participate tonight, whether you're here in this room or whether you're watching online, you yourselves are co-sponsors of this event. And these types of events wouldn't happen without you and your support. So thank you. So let's give ourselves a big round of applause for making tonight possible. Thank you. I want to talk for just a couple minutes about Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon and what we've got going on right now. To get us started with that, why don't you go ahead and watch this?
Imagine loving people, no matter who they are. Democrat, Republican, or independent. Christian, Jewish, Muslim, or no religion at all. Imagine loving people no matter where they come from, what they look like, or who they love. Imagine loving the people everyone else forgets. What if loving people meant walking with them, not rescuing them? What if acts of love didn't come with a bunch of strings attached? After careful calculation, what if we simply put love first?
That kind of describes our heart and some of our direct service programs and other programs. I want to quickly highlight a couple of things happening right now that you are probably not aware of. As we all know, there are a lot of us here in Oregon who are vaccine hesitant. You've probably heard about this in the news. Some of our fellow Oregonians who don't want to be vaccinated. And religious folks, they make up kind of the #1 population in Oregon that is vaccine hesitant. So we've been engaged by the Oregon Health Authority to reach out to those folks, trying to understand what's going on and see if we can't turn the dial just a little bit. So we've been doing a lot of community organizing, having a lot of conversations, doing some listening, trying our best to understand. And we've also been producing a series of videos by faith leaders, some of whom are in the room here tonight, talking about why they chose to be vaccinated. Our goal, like I said, is to just turn the dial even just a little bit when it comes to faith and the vaccine, showing that science and faith don't have to be in conflict, and in fact, the choice to be vaccinated for many is influenced by their faith. So those videos will be out in the next couple of weeks. We hope that they'll be a resource to you and your communities, and we hope that they get spread far and wide, again, to kind of just just change the conversation ever so slightly as much as we can in the state of Oregon. Another thing I want to make you aware of that's been a big thing for EMO in the last couple of months, we all watched, probably, I would say in horror, as the United States military withdrew from Afghanistan. And this created, I'm sure we all felt it, a real kind of moral imperative for us in this country to welcome refugees. And this has been part of the work of EMO for a long time. Our resettlement agency has been going for 40 years. We've resettled 25,000 refugees. And so we were sort of made for a moment like this. And they have already been responding, and they have already resettled Afghan refugees in the greater Portland area and will continue to do so in the weeks and months and probably years ahead. That's not even to mention our SOAR legal program, which is gearing up to help with all of the different hoops that refugees have to jump through to be able to stay in our country. We know that a lot of people want to be engaged in this work. You can visit our website to find out how you can be involved. We've created a fund called our Refugee Rapid Response Fund that you can contribute to if you want to kind of lend your muscle, so to speak, to this moral imperative to welcome refugees with open arms here in the state of Oregon. These are dark times, as we've talked about. There is kind of a cloud hanging over many, many things right now. One of the beautiful things about that is it gives good people the opportunity to kind of let the better angels of their nature shine through. And that's exactly what our programs are all about. Our Northeast Emergency Food Program just crossed the threshold of serving 1 million people since the COVID-19 pandemic began. Our HIV services program continues to serve folks living with HIV/AIDS. Our ROS program serving victims of sexual assault and domestic violence. Our Second Home program that serves houseless youth. They're going to be featured in this Sunday's issue of the Oregonian in the season of sharing that happens every year, so that's really exciting. We'd encourage you to look for that article coming out. As you can hear, there's a lot of ways to be involved. We know that people of faith and goodwill want to rise up in times of difficulty and times of struggle. So we'd encourage you to continue to be a part of our movement, either as a volunteer or just as part of our network, kind of lending your voice to the causes that beat in many of our hearts. And of course, you can give financially. We always want to encourage people to do that. There's a number of ways you can do that. You can give online. There's a text to give number. If you're in the room here tonight, you can drop a gift in the basket that's sitting on our welcome table back there. Whatever it is that you do, however you can be involved, we want to say thank you for being part of EMO and the movement that we're all pulling hard toward making Oregon a more just and sustainable place, not just for the people at the top, but for everybody. With that, I want to turn it over to our second keynote for the evening, Miss Kaitlin Curtice.
Kaitlin Curtice is an enrolled member of the Potawatomi Citizen Band. Having grown up in the Christian faith, she writes on the intersection of Indigenous spirituality, faith in everyday life, and the church. She has contributed to On Being, Religion News Service, USA Today, and Sojourners, among others. In 2018, she was featured in a documentary with CBS called Race, Religion, and Resistance, speaking on the dangers of colonized Christianity. Kaitlin's newest book is Native: Identity, Belonging, and Rediscovering God. Kaitlin has been a featured speaker at Why Christian, Evolving Faith, Wild Goose Festival, the Festival of Faith and Writing, and more.
Hello, everyone. Again, I'm Kaitlin Curtice. I am an essayist, a poet, and a public speaker, and I am a citizen of the Potawatomi Nation, living on land tended to and cared for by the Lenape people. I'm so glad to be with you all and to talk about this topic of white nationalism and white supremacy and my journey of decolonization and what I think that it can teach us today. So I'm really grateful to be here with you. If you've read my book, Native, you know that I frame decolonization within my book and within my own story as a way of engaging with colonial systems like patriarchy and white supremacy and asking how we can dismantle their power in our lives and in our communities. And so I want to share a little more about that today. So there's definitely a very technical and academic term for decolonization, which is to free from colonial status. There are indigenous groups, there are political groups who are having conversations on that level all the time, and that needs to be taken very seriously. The way that I frame decolonization within my own work, like I said, is to help us examine these systems. So talking about white nationalism, talking about white supremacy as a way of entering into this conversation and examining what role these systems play in our lives. That too is the work of decolonization. And I will say that, different people need to use different terms for whatever part of the journey they are on. For example, a few years ago, I would not have used the term decolonization as a tool that sort of fits my life, but instead I was using a term deconstruction, right? Which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So when I was writing my first book, which is called Glory Happening, I was just starting to deconstruct. I was just starting to ask questions and sort of pull apart the web of, what I grew up with, my religious experience growing up. I was just starting to ask, is God this white judge with a gavel? Is Jesus a white savior? I started to wonder about the language I was using around ideas of spirituality and religion, right? I was referring to God as mystery, which is something I didn't grow up doing. And doing those things really helped me widen the view beyond my Southern upbringing, beyond what I had been taught, which was an upbringing and a religious experience deeply steeped in white nationalism and white supremacy. Because of the assimilation and colonization that I've lived through in the church, I didn't grow up knowing that the Potawatomi people are originally from the Great Lakes region of the United States. I did not know to call this land Turtle Island. I didn't know that we have our own language as a people. And so over the years, I have been studying different creation stories of different traditions with my kids. I read them, or obviously we read the Hebrew creation stories found in the Bible, or we study the 7 grandfather teachings of our culture alongside the teachings of the Gospels. And we find that we must learn what it means to live in an integrated way that honors the cultures and the people around us, so that together in solidarity, we can sort of bring each other home, right? And that means that we pay attention to the horrors of colonization and white supremacy that have plagued the church for so long. So I mentioned these 7 grandfather teachings, and I just want to talk about them for a moment. There are these teachings in our culture that call us back to these just central ideas, and you'll be familiar with them. They are humility, honesty, bravery, wisdom, truth, love, and respect. And so in other words, these teachings help us to work out what it means to be human, right? To work out what it means to carry these gifts in the right way, and to have a good heart, and to honor the earth, and to honor the creatures of the earth and each other along the way. And so the deeper I lean into these teachings, these 7 grandfather teachings and those stories, the more I find this interconnectedness among all religions and cultures and faiths. And our work is to call each other home, to call to each other and say, this is for you. This is what it means to be human, to love and be loved. This is what it means to learn from one another. And that is how we begin to break down these toxic and hurtful systems. So in living a holistic life, I am working to engage in a holistic faith, so I can't compartmentalize or separate out the various parts of who I am or what I believe. And that means that my journey has meant including all of who I am, right? And then that means that I have to include all of who we are, and that we have to come into these difficult conversations for the sake of one another. If we are all to engage in this way of belief for ourselves and those around us, we would see God in our midst, right? We would be okay with having these difficult conversations and breaking through all of the history, like you heard about earlier in the Jesus and John Wayne book. The ways that these different movements within the white evangelical faith have led us there today, led us to where we are. Having those conversations, that is how we begin to decolonize. That is how we begin to tell the truth about history, right? And that's how so many of us begin to free ourselves from some of those systems we grew up with. So like I said, I use deconstruction as a beginning path, right? And then the term decolonization became really helpful for me in my next step of my deconstruction journey. Not just untangling those truths of what I grew up with, but then beginning to ask myself and my community how we can dismantle these oppressive or colonial systems that are affecting everyone, that are affecting the earth, that are affecting the creatures of the earth. And so while we're here, of course, I want to stop and remind us that decolonization is lifelong work, okay? It's cyclical work, it's seasonal work, it's going to take a long time. We don't just, we aren't just going to one day suddenly be done decolonizing. It's not just going to be like, okay, we did it, we're done, This is intergenerational work, and it's important to remember that. I always want to remind us that we're coming up against and examining these systems that have been around for a really long time, and these institutions that have been built by white supremacy or white nationalism. And that means that we can't just burn out quickly. We have to have longevity for the work. And decolonization is work that is meant to be built on embodiment and on longevity. And so in my book, Native, I write that our spiritual realities do not exist in a vacuum. So when there is oppression happening around us, even if it isn't to us, we're still affected by it. And therefore we have a part to play in the dismantling of it and in the healing process. So if we truly belong to each other, if we are kin, that means our spirits are connected, and that part of being human is honoring that connection. And this is an important lesson for us to be learning in America right now, that we belong to one another, that we are connected, right? Because we seem to have a hard time understanding how our spiritual realities are connected. That conversation is really hard right now, and I think it's important to remember. So I want to share with you 3 things that sort of some lessons that I've been learning along the way that are connected to my decolonization journey, and that of course are connected to my book, Native. So these are the 3 lessons I want to talk about. 1, all humans need to honor our connection to the earth. All humans need to honor our connection to the earth. Number 2, whiteness is a system, not a finger point. Whiteness is a system, not a finger point. And number 3, decolonization is always an invitation. Decolonization is always an invitation. So let's get to number 1. All humans need to honor our connection to the earth. In 2018, 13-year-old Autumn Peltier from Manitoulin Island in Canada shared her wisdom and experiences with world leaders at the UN General Assembly. And she was reminding them of their responsibility to protect the water, to treat the water in a way that reflects a sacred creation, as we believe as Anishinaabe people. That the water is a being, right? It has wisdom. And Autumn represents future generations of our children and our grandchildren who are inheriting a world that is tired and resilient, that has been abused for centuries. So Indigenous peoples, as we practice kinship with creation, we have a way of helping sort of reorient all of us to the importance of caring for the earth's water, which is our lifeblood. So in Western thought, what we have been taught to believe in America is that fear and this mentality of scarcity, right? They're distortions of reality. And what happens then is it makes everything sort of an enemy, instead of reminding us that all the creatures of the earth and all parts of creation have roles and abilities and wisdom, right? That can be manifested to hurt or to heal. And so how do we view a flood, right? As it destroys everything. How do we view a drought? Human beings have been destroying the earth's natural ability to make her own decisions for centuries. And she's beginning to let us know that our actions have harmful consequences. So climate change, right, manifests in earthquakes and tsunamis. We have harsh winters that claim our homeless populations because our systems are not supporting them. We have insects that are disappearing, right? Crops that are drying up. People are going hungry and droughts. We continue to poison the water for future generations with pipelines. We care more about our capitalistic profit, created by these systems of white supremacy, than we care about protecting the creatures of the earth. And so how do we expect Sigamokwe, or Mother Earth, to respond when we treat her this way? How do we ask Creator to forgive us when there is nothing left of the earth to care for, when we have destroyed so much? We don't really talk a lot about kinship as a way of living, but truly it is the way of solidarity. We belong to one another, and so we belong to the earth, and none of that can be separated out. It's all connected, and it's connected to the mindset and the mentalities that we have created, especially within Christianity. So if we are doing decolonizing work, right, we recognize the ways that we have harmed the earth through these systems of colonization and capitalism and white supremacy. And so we work to dismantle those systems wherever we can, even in our personal lives, even in our families, in our communities. Maybe it's through supporting Indigenous peoples who are protesting pipelines peacefully. Maybe we put pressure on politicians to make decisions that will honor the earth instead of destroying her. The lesson here is that all humans need to honor our connections to the earth. Not just Indigenous people, right? Not just animals, all human beings, everyone. We have that sacred connection to the earth that honestly has been rooted out a lot by Christianity, by a lot of the things that we have grown up with. These systems of colonization have taught us to take dominion, right? And that's not a relationship. And so can we travel and journey the earth with love and kinship at the forefront of our minds? I believe that we can. And so here are some ways to get practical. Here are some ways to come up against some of these systems. Start small. Start wherever you need to start. Maybe you speak to your houseplants. You speak to them. You begin a relationship to them when you dust their leaves or you water them. Remind them that they are beautiful. Grow flowers in the spring and honor the seeds as beings. When you go fishing, ask permission to be at the water and thank the fish that you catch. And begin to notice the way your posture toward the earth changes as you practice this relationship, this kinship. Honor Indigenous people's rights and ways of caring for the land. Learn about how colonization has hurt the land. Maybe literally place your hand on the ground and talk to the earth and tell her that you're sorry for the ways we've treated her. And then do it all over again and find new ways to do it and do those things with friends, right? These are the lessons that we're learning again and again. These are the ways that we begin the journey of decolonization, is through re-entering into that connection to the earth, that sacred connection. So that's number one. Number two, whiteness is a system, not a finger point. Whiteness is a system, not a finger point. And this is an important one for us to talk about as we examine systems of whiteness and white nationalism, because our systems define us, and we need to be able to talk about these uncomfortable things in order to dismantle harmful institutions that don't allow all humans to be fully loved and seen as fully sacred, right? We need to talk about the fact that America was founded on and continues to remain because of systems of whiteness and white supremacy that brought us to this point. I have a chapter in Native called The Problem of Whiteness, and people have refused to read my book just because of the title of that chapter, because of those words. And the reality is I'm not here to tell anyone that being white is wrong. As a white-coded Potawatomi woman, someone who is mixed culture and mixed ethnicity, I'm not here to point a finger at anyone's skin. But I am here to point the way to solidarity by recognizing that systems of whiteness aim to destroy some and uphold the power of others. And this is not what it means to be kin. This is not what it means to belong to one another. So the lesson is to recognize that we are here to call out a system that we belong to. We're pointing to these systems that we want to change or dismantle. And so when we get wrapped up in these personal narratives of, I'm not like that, or that's not who I am, we're losing this opportunity to create change on a larger level. So we have to recognize where and how and why we belong to one another, right? We celebrate our differences by holding up injustice, by speaking the truth into all spaces. And that directly goes up against so much of what we're talking about today, right? That is the work of decolonization. What I learned in my Baptist church growing up was how to be, a devout evangelical, right? I was being taught that for my identity to matter, I must assimilate and I must take on that American dream as best I could. That those narratives, whatever they may be within the church. And so what ends up happening when you grow up within these narratives of white nationalism is that my life became about pleasing this Americanized God who can never be pleased. At the end of the day, I was way more scared of God than I had a relationship with God. That it was this image of that judge with a gavel, right, ready to judge me. And we remember that people have been oppressed by the church, oppressed in the name of Jesus, told that they cannot know God in the way they were born to know God. And that has resulted in these serious, splits and fractures in the world. And so when we remember that, when we come and have these conversations, we begin to ask questions, right? Many of us ask, is God this God who is white, this Zeus type of being, a God who is this patriarchal man, right? the one that's been modeled so much within these movements of Christianity and evangelical Christianity. How can this be God? How can the church reconcile this? How do we reconcile that now, right? When the church itself sometimes feels like it's imploding. How can the white evangelical church, with a history of complicity and abuse toward indigenous peoples, ask any questions about the nature of God if we cannot ask ourselves to take an honest look at our own intentions, at our own institutions? Vine Deloria Jr. has a book called God is Red, and I really recommend it to all of you. And this is what he writes in God is Red. Instead of working toward the kingdom of God on earth, history becomes a story of a particular race fulfilling its manifest destiny. So whiteness is a culture that requires the erasure of all others, considering them less than. It is believing in that well-known metaphor of a melting pot that we so love to hold on to in America, but erasing the value and the lives of the other within that narrative. So in the process, we're presenting the idea of assimilation as a virtue. But in reality, assimilation is about power. It's about power that puts shackles on Black people and indigenous people, other people of color. So let's center ourselves again in this space, being present to this moment and to this conversation and to the work ahead of us, and the work that we're doing right now. So what can we do right now to dismantle these systems that are so oppressive and fueled by hate? You're here, and that's a beginning, that's a start, that's a piece of the process. But what we need to do is just ask these questions. Take some time and sit with your own story, sit with your own experiences. Take a look at it from that decolonizing lens and ask what changes can be made, small changes in your life. What systems are you a part of, right, that are harming others? It's important for all of us to ask this question. So that's number 2, lesson number 2. Lesson number 3, decolonization is always an invitation. And I really love this one, and I believe it's really important. I hope by now that you're feeling this reality, that this work of solidarity and dismantling these systems of oppression toward others in the earth, it is an invitation. It is a gift. It's this, warm welcome into a more embodied way of being. I know that the idea of decolonization can feel really scary to a lot of people. And it's not a journey or an idea or an embodiment that should be taken lightly in any way. But it is something that I want people to understand, that there is an excitement and there's an opportunity and there's a really beautiful gift of dreaming for a better world inside the work of decolonization. So for me, decolonization is always fueled by my questions, right? Those first questions I asked as I was deconstructing, which led to deeper questions that became my decolonization work. It's like a fire fueled by oxygen, right? That first spark, that first flicker begins the work. And so I often picture decolonization also as like an outstretched hand. It's a hand that's saying to you, what if there is another way? What if there is a better way? And isn't that a beautiful picture to hold on to, this outstretched hand that's just asking the question? So one big question for me is this one. What does it mean to be Indigenous? To have any ties to the person of Jesus without being tied to these destructive colonizing institutions of the church? It's a constant decolonizing for me. It's this constant longing for interaction with others who, following this universal Christ, as Richard Rohr calls it, can take on the hope of a decolonizing faith. It's sharing space with Black people, Indigenous people, people of color, disabled and queer people, letting our experiences shape one another. It means interacting with my white friends and having really difficult conversations, right? Facing my own privilege in those conversations. Deconstruction and decolonization can be partners, along with grief and truth-telling. There's so much space in this. There's so many layers and nuance that go along with our experiences and our stories and listening to the stories of others, right? And so I hope that we learn from the work of community that we are called to the bigger work ahead of us, because we need each other. Together, we have to know what it means to return to mystery, right? To return to that space that has always wanted all of us, right? We do this work together so that each day that we're doing this work, we're building a future that is made for everyone. And so we remember that embracing and repairing our relationship to the earth, and understanding the systems of whiteness around us, and understanding decolonization as an invitation. These are all ways that we can move forward to free ourselves from the traps of white supremacy that have controlled so much of what we know today. By simply rewiring our brains, right? By simply unlearning some of the things we've been taught. You know, it's Native American Heritage Month, and so much of my struggle is that we are given so little space to celebrate who we are, and instead we are tasked with so much education. And that's because our systems and what we're taught in America and the church don't prepare us as adults to celebrate Indigenous peoples. And so we are left with trying to re-educate, trying to help people unlearn. And that's a burden. It's really exhausting. And I want us to be able to move forward together, listening to one another, doing this work of decolonization, beginning where we're at, and taking the time to ask how we can dismantle these systems, or you know, like you heard earlier, like how can these movements be paid attention to? How can we pay attention to history so that we know where we're going, we know where we've come from, and we can have better conversations? So I want to end our time here with a story from Native. This is a reflection on future generations, because they're the ones who will carry on the work of decolonization that we are beginning today. You know, you will carry it on and you'll pass it on to whoever comes after you. And those lessons will just continue. The work of decolonization continues, you know, generation by generation, you know, as we love to learn better. And this is from the last chapter of Native. So I want to read this to you. One afternoon, as we were getting ready to move from one house to another across town, I was going through old containers of our belongings. The week before, my therapist asked me if I had any journals from when I was young, and I found them, beginning in 4th grade, right after my parents divorced. I found journals with notes on every sin I believed I had committed, every shame that hung over my head. I told God I was sorry more than I reminded myself that I am loved and valuable and sacred. The church taught me to view my life as a series of boxes to be ticked off. Every day was a choice. Did you save someone's soul from hell or didn't you? Did you sin or didn't you? Were you pure or weren't you? And yet I hope something different for my children. I hope something for their future that begins with the sacredness of who they are, that begins with the sacredness of the earth and the many gifts she pours over us day after day. Richard Rohr writes, "We'll never solve the way to a new life in our heads. We have to live our way into a new kind of thinking." This is exactly what the children around us embody. If my children can remember that the things they experience, including all the people and the creatures around them, are sacred, maybe they won't grow up commodifying everything and everyone. Maybe they will learn what it means to live a constantly decolonizing existence, to value what is so often forgotten around us, to love people and our creature kin simply because they were created to be loved. In 2019, one of our dear friends who is Jewish invited us to his home for a Seder dinner to commemorate Passover. This same friend has brought us into his home many times, sharing his culture with us, letting us sit in his presence and see a reality that is different from ours, but tethers us to really powerful lessons on resilience and love. And that night, as my 2 kids sat at the ends of the tables listening, our friend Daniel walked us through the story of the Hebrew people, slavery, liberation, joining in the work of freedom for their friends, including Indigenous people. My children will always remember dipping parsley into salt water to remind them of the bitterness of hate and slavery, and they will always remember singing and eating with the adults in the room as we talked about what freedom might look like for all people. In the church, instead of learning to fight against injustice, particularly for Jewish people, we are taught anti-Semitic messages, such as the notion that Jews were to blame for Jesus' death. But my boys will come alongside their Jewish kin and their friends of other religions and cultures to fight against injustice, just as they join their Christian friends to create a better, more loving world. Our children must learn that to become a more complete representation of God in the world, we must learn to see the sacred value of God in one another. This is what I hope for my children and for your children and for my neighbors next door, for people across the ocean that I will never meet. If we can learn to believe not just that people are sacred, but that the earth is sacred, that she is our teacher, that the creatures around us are sacred, maybe our children will be able to pave the way for a better future for all of us. Maybe they will be the ones who fight climate change, who save our rainforests, who write in their journals, I know I am beloved. I know the earth is beloved. I know my neighbor is beloved. We live in an era in which the young people are leading us. They are leading us on issues of gun control and climate change. They're leading protests and marches. They're making phone calls to their senators. They are changing systems that must be changed. Some of them are showing up to vote because they know that they are the holders of the future. They know they have a chance to change things. And we should give them everything they need to do it. Being a parent means participating in the active communal work of loving and letting go of our children, of preparing and sending them out to make room on the earth for more love and more hope. And that stretches beyond religion and culture, beyond family name. It is the work of the human soul. And it is also beyond the work of parenthood. All of our children belong to all of us because that's what kinship does. It's a reminder of that dust that we came from and that dust we return to. It's a reminder that while we are here, we make room for the next generation to spring up from the soil and create a new landscape. So our Native children lead us. Our children of color lead us. Our daughters lead us. Our queer and gender non-binary children lead us. Our disabled children lead us. The ones that are forgotten lead us. The ones that are told to be quiet at the dinner table lead us. And if we are smart, we will let them lead. If we are smart, we will see that we all return to mystery, to Kache Manado, and we are simply to learn what we can along the way, to embody humility, to stand up to bullies, and to show them the way to love and peace. Thank you.
So once upon a time at a Collins Summit, we would be together all day. We would have breakout sessions, we would have plenaries, and every person on this stage would be leading one, and I would go to all of them in this case. And so I pray for the day where we get that kind of time and nuance together to go deeper. We'll see, we'll see what next year brings. So I'm going to ask a broad question, and I'm going to ask the same question to all of you, and because I know that you each come from your own backgrounds and community contexts, but she talks a lot about decolonization. And so I'm going to give you a very broad opening, and then I'm going to ask you to answer it in a pithy way, because I'm not sure what time it is or whatever, but Sal, I want to start with you. I'm going to go in reverse alphabetical order this time. What does decolonization mean in 2021 and for you and your community?
Well, as I had mentioned earlier to the first speaker, I talked about a series of how the doctrine of discovery, and I gave you some examples of what that looks like today. But to break that down a little further, just the idea of colonization, for example, coming from the Greeks. Look at the word colonize. The origin of colonize is colon. So colon is to digest. So if in use of the word colonization, then it's the process of digesting indigenous wealth, resources, and so on. So that's from a historical perspective, but also you look at the legal perspective of a series of case law, Supreme Court case law, and so on. And give you an example. Some of you may think very highly of Ruth Bader Gingrich. I question that. The reason I question that is Ruth Bader Gingrich, in all her wisdom, used and invoked the doctrine of discovery, again, the idea of colonization, and rendered her opinion. So as early as 2015, we're still using those Greek words, again, originating with colonization. So when we use language, I'll give you another example of language. In my language, we have the word tamanwit. Tamanwit means a way of life. It's all encompassing. It's a word of reciprocity, inclusion, interconnection. So again, all those words come from dominant culture, but also they speak to the positive things that we can begin use. Just our language, we can begin changing language. For example, the idea of tribes. We were never tribes. We were a series of nations when Europeans came to our lands. We were not tribes. So that's a new word reinvented to fit what Europeans met with when they came to Turtle Island. So it's not only here in the Americas, but again, globally. So those are some ways that we can begin to look at the idea of colonization. So I leave that with you.
Thank you so much, Sam. Pastor Rick, same question.
Yeah, I think this will probably, I just think more probably close to home in our community. So about 9 years ago, we started the work of diversity and equity and access, that work with much more intentionality. And by engaging that work, really relationally, it revealed how much of that is in us, right? That kind of, whether it was white privilege, that racism, those things that we as white people would carry. To watch this very slow process, right, for a very white community and a very niche kind of, like it's inner East Side Portland. Eric Knox came on staff to help do the work, and I remember the first Sunday we have this guy up here with a banjo, and then he puts his banjo down and he starts banging on 2 blocks, wooden blocks, and Eric's like, yeah, that's not gonna cut it really, and thankfully we have Johanna and Steve over at Imago East Side saving our lives, but I think we also saw a number of people leave, like a few hundred people leave, wow, with the idea that I'm tired of being told this, and I can trace my history back to the Mayflower, and so this narrative that it's not in me personally, this sort of individualism, that I can separate myself from these systems somehow, is such a myth, and yet it is so rampant within, I think, the church and the American mindset. It's also, I think, changed the way that you see the scriptures, and to recognize that these are written by from below, right? They're not written by the dominant culture. They're written from the bottom. As Eric Knox calls it, a theology from below. And so, for instance, when we think of the verse, the Apostle Paul says, it has this verse, I have been crucified with Christ, therefore I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. And people put that verse on because it's like, that'll help give me strength to lose weight or whatever it is. But he uses that verse in the context of Peter, who is disassociating himself from Gentiles. And because he's starting to other himself from the Gentiles again. And Paul says, he rebukes him to his face, and then he says, basically whatever that thing was in me that allowed me to look down on, to other, to distance myself and marginalize people, that has been crucified with Christ. Therefore, that no longer lives, but Christ lives in me. And then you chase that down to Galatians 3:28, where neither Jew nor Gentile, slave, free, male, female, we're all one in Christ. And so I don't know that I was using the words decolonization, but I think it's the work of really incarnation and recognizing that that I am continually having to return to the cross for my own salvation, to be crucified again from all these forces that want to be the colonizer, I guess, right? To then pick up sort of the courage, the faith, whatever it is, to walk in the Spirit, to be able to walk in the dust of the rabbi that is living this alternative story. So I don't know. That's what I would say.
Thank you. Reverend Ernestine.
Yes. First, I want to say that Christopher Columbus did not discover America. He colonized America. And I think the narrative that we take away from that is that, and what she is talking about when she's talking about decolonization, is returning to a people that which was taken from them. And so when I think about decolonizing, I don't only think about Christopher Columbus, but I think about the enslaved people that were brought here and all that was taken away from them, their names, their language, their culture, everything that made them human was taken in the process of colonization. And when she speaks about decolonizing, it's a sense of restoration, restoring to people what we want to strip them of and what we want to take away from them. And I think it's so prevalent, not only when it started, but now we are in the process of we want to colonize people again. And I think as Christians and as followers of Jesus Christ, it is incumbent upon us to continue the process she talks about on an ongoing basis of decolonizing, not only, as you say, that which is in us that wants to be the colonizer, that wants to be the superior, that wants to be the person that tells everybody else what to do and how they should live. And I think if we are truly going to walk in the way of Jesus of Nazareth, we have to rid ourselves of that. One of the things that struck me about this book in a quote that I wrote down that just resonated with me is whiteness is a culture that requires the erasure of all others. And that is the perfect example of colonization, because you want to take away from people that which makes them human. And if we are going to move forward to a place where we can all be fed, we can all be nourished, we can all be acknowledged as created in the image and likeness of God, then we have to go through this spiritual process of decolonizing, of cleansing ourselves. It is not something that happens, as she says, it's not a one-time thing. It's something that we have to do each and every day. And as you say, it's something that we have to do with intentionality and purpose. Since COVID and all the protests, I've had so many conversations with Western European Americans about, it's not me, as you say, my family didn't own slaves. Yeah, but you know what? You benefit. And until we own our sense of colonizers, until we recognize that we have been a part of the colonization process, we remain stuck. And we cannot become unstuck until we recognize that. We are all colonizers. We have been colonizers. Now we can make the decision on a daily basis to decolonize ourselves, to cleanse ourselves, and to really and truly look and recognize one another as brothers and sisters in Christ.
Amen. I have about 3 follow-up questions. They're all about reparations, and but they're going to have to hold. I want to give the final word to Andrea tonight.
Thank you, Michael. And I would like to kind of invite the final word from everyone here in this sanctuary and all who are in our virtual community to share with us in some way, shape, or form your sense of this evening and what your journey, how your journey will begin to decolonize, the processes that can be shared, the process that we can learn from each other. I know for me tonight, 2 things. One is that I resonate a lot with Kaitlin's journey, being a Latina who was raised in a Spanish-speaking Southern Baptist church in East LA, and having to understand that as I entered in my journey of faith, which took me to different destinations and clearly brought me into the fold of interfaith and ecumenical life and community. And her words tonight for me, and I just wanted to say 2. The word colonization echoes in my culture to remind us that people know him as Christopher Columbus. We know him as Cristobal Colón. And the Colón, again, can be the root of colonization. So I'm reminded of that every time I hear that word. She compels me for this lifelong journey of realization and confession and redoing of self before deconstructing and reconstructing. And to answer, and I'm going to read this here because I wrote this and I'm thinking I won't remember it all, and to answer over and over again, what does it mean to be faithful in all things? How do I share the good news, the gospel, in a way that doesn't erase any of us? How will I continue to peel away layers of embedded white narratives and images so I can see the hues of my own brownness, the papery, thin, blue-veined hands I've inherited from my grandmother, Rosa Mosqueda, from Michoacan, Mexico, and other things that I realized from her? And in my time, in the short time I will be with Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon, and with amazing 60-plus staff and as many on the board and committees of this organization, my hope is that the process of decolonization will be a dimension of our own stated aim to become an anti-racist organization. That the decolonization will be another part as we sojourn as staff and governance through an ethical framework for diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility for life our EMO ideal, that the obligations we have to assure this comes to fruition, and that the colonization is always, as Kaitlin says, an invitation for each of us to extend and to accept. And as we go, says Kaitlin, let's pray into the world, pray into this world what we believe is possible.
Thank you. Let's give a round of hand to all of our panelists tonight. When we're back in person, I hope to have those plenary sessions still, so I'll look forward to it. But thank you so much. Let's take our seat for a minute. There's going to be one more song before we close, and then we'll have a benediction.
So this last song that we're going to sing was again written by my husband here, Stephen, and it's called Harmony. It's an original song, and we pray you all enjoy it.
Christ loves you, I'll share his love the way he do, like one big choir, not without voices, but with our lives unified in perfect harmony. Like a symphony, you and me. As Christ loves you, as Christ loves me, I'll share his love the way he do, like one big choir, not without voices, but without lives unified in perfect harmony, like a symphony, you and me. In Christ, there's oneness. Through Christ, where there's harmony, and fear will fade away where there's harmony. You and me in harmony.
Christ is revealed where there's harmony.
Healing's revealed.
Healing's revealed
Oh, yeah.
where there's harmony.
And fear will fade away. Where there's harmony. You and me in harmony. Christ is revealed where there's harmony. Healing's revealed
Where there's harmony.
fear will fade away. Where there's harmony. You and me in perfect harmony. Can we sing that one more time? Oh, Christ is
revealed where there's harmony.
Healing's revealed where there's harmony. And fear will fade away.
Where there's harmony.
You and me in perfect harmony. You and me in harmony. It's you and me in perfect harmony. You and me in perfect harmony, like a symphony. You and me in perfect harmony, like a symphony. You and me.
Reverend Flemister's looking for her benediction on her phone. It got bumped when she was walking up here. Why don't we all stand together while she's finding it, and she's going to close us out. I think this was maybe the first Collins Summit where there was a rap. Can anybody confirm that or not? First rap at a Collins Summit. Thank you so much. We loved it. It was beautiful. Thank you to everybody who joined online, and I'm going to hand it over to the Reverend.
Thank you. May God grant to the living grace, to the departed rest, to the nation peace and concord, to us all, your servants, grace and purpose and hope, light to guide us on our way, courage to support us, and your blessing to unite us in our service. May God bless you and keep you. May God make his face to shine upon you, and may God be merciful and gracious unto you. Amen.